Good evening. My name is John Dillinger. I expect some of you might have heard of me. I've been called a lot of things. Cold-blooded murderer, leader of a gang organization terrorizing the Midwest, public enemy number one. Now, I like that one. It's all a matter of perspective. You see, all I did was avail myself of a few resources from a few banks in 1933 and 1934. Now, a few people got hurt. There were a few exciting chases, a few narrow escapes, but it's all a matter of perspective. It's all how you look at it. As much as I'd like to talk about myself, tonight I'd like to talk about a woman that I loved. Her trial here in St. Paul, the lovely Miss Evelyn Frechette, affectionately known as Billy.
Only one big thing ever happened to me in my life. Nothing much happened before, and I don't expect much after, except maybe for a lot more grief. The one big thing that happened to me was I fell in love with John Dillinger. The government people say I harbored a criminal. I lived with Johnny for a few months, if that's what they mean. I loved him. I just followed him around the country, from Chicago to Florida to Tucson, where he was caught. But then, you know, he broke out of Crown Point jail with a wooden gun, and he came back to me. So we beat it for St. Paul, and that's where we had the shooting scrape and nearly got killed.
Now that scrape led to Billy being caught. You see, I was wounded in the escape, and I had to be taken care of by a doctor and a nurse in Minneapolis. It slowed us down a bit, but we did finally make it back to Chicago. But that's when the FBI caught up with us. Now, I was in a car down the street when it happened.
I was at this tavern at State in Austin in Chicago. I just ordered myself a glass of beer and drank it, and I was walking outside to meet Johnny, who was waiting for me. And just then, about 5 or 6 men came bursting through the door with pistols in their hands and machine guns, and they said, "All right, Billy." Yeah, people call me Billy just as much as they call me Evelyn. Anyway, they put handcuffs on me and marched me outside and threw me into a car. And they asked me all kinds of questions, as if I was going to know anything. But they brought me back here to St. Paul, and now I'm in trial.
When I found out what happened, I was, shall we say, very upset. I hired my personal lawyer, Louis Paquette, to take the case, and he did. Now, I wasn't there in the courtroom, but I sure knew what was going on, you see. I had my own people in the courtroom, and I had the newspaper every day in Chicago to let me know what was happening. The only reason I didn't break Billy out of jail is people kept convincing me that if I did, I'd be killed. Now, George Sullivan was the prosecuting attorney, and Paquette was defending Billy. The case was tried by Judge Gunnar H. Norby right here in the Federal Building in St. Paul. Witness after witness came forward to try to identify me in pictures. Now, the charge was harboring a criminal. The prosecution spent hours trying to identify me in pictures. The trial began May 15th, 1934.
The government calls Mrs. Daisy S. Coffey.
Mrs. Daisy S. Coffey. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
Mrs. Coffey, where do you reside?
95 South Lexington.
And how long have you lived in St. Paul?
28 years, 10 years at South Lexington.
Now, do you own that property?
My husband and I do, you betcha.
Now, would you in a general way state what sort of property is? Would you describe it? What sort of building is there?
It's a 3-story, 32 apartment building. It has 10 apartments on each floor and 2 in the basement. It's on the corner of Lexington and Lincoln. And it has 1-room and 2-room apartments. They all have a dinette kitchenette. And the 1 rooms have a Murphy bed, and the 2 rooms have a bedroom.
And you rent these apartments?
I am in charge of the rentals, and I am assisted by a caretaker, Mr. Meidlinger, and he and his wife have been with us for 10 years.
Now, do you recall renting apartment 303 in your building on or about March 19th, 1934?
I do, you betcha.
And do you recall who rented the building? What were the type of people?
Well, I had been out, and I remember when I came back, Mr. Meidlinger came in and he brought this lady, and he said that he had rented her apartment 303 and that she wanted a receipt and to pay me. Well, she paid me and I gave her a receipt.
Now, did you see that woman who paid you for the rental of that apartment?
I saw her in the apartment, but I don't remember the exact date. I just remember it was that week that that they left the apartment.
Now, Ms. Coffey, can you try to give me the date a little bit more accurately?
I couldn't positively. There were more than one woman involved in the situation, and I admit 2 or 3 are rather confusing. I just remember that there was another shorter lady than the one who rented the apartment.
Okay, and you say that there were people around the apartment. Did you see them leave the apartment?
I saw her enter the apartment 303.
You did. And did you see her leave?
I saw her. I'm sorry, could you repeat that question, please?
Well, what I'm trying to get at is if you saw the woman leave the apartment and what date she might have left that apartment.
No, I don't remember the date exactly. I'm sorry.
Was that date possibly the 31st of
I am
March?
sorry. That's right. I am so sorry. The day that they left the apartment was March 31st of this year. That's when they left the apartment, you betcha.
Okay, now, Ms. Coffey, you said that there were 2 or 3 women that you saw around this apartment, and that one was shorter than the other. Now, do you see in this courtroom here today the woman that was in that apartment during the month of March 1934? Stand up, Miss Frechette. Would you please stand up? Now, Miss Coffey, do you see that woman here in the courtroom today?
Yep, she's standing right there.
You may sit down, Miss Frechette. Now, Miss Coffey, when you saw this woman, what was she doing?
Well, she was coming in the back door and she was carrying groceries. And I also remember that I saw her this one time ironing in her red shorts and a tank top.
Okay, well. Did you observe whether or not she entered apartment 303?
She did.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Certainly, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Ms. Coffey, I show you what has been identified as Government Exhibit 4. Now, there have been several witnesses that identified this picture as being John Dillinger. And you've told us about the activity around the apartment building. Please tell us whether you ever saw this man around the building?
Nope.
Would you take another look at this picture, Miss Coffey?
Well, he's not as handsome as you are, but I'd have remembered the face if I'd have seen it.
Well, could you possibly tell us anything else that may have happened around this date in the apartment on the 31st?
You betcha. It was about 10:30, and I remember it was 10:30 because I was making my tapioca pudding. And, well, I remember seeing these 2 guys that were going into the back door, the opposites of where I was at. And then Mr. Coulter came and he was talking to me, and then I heard a knock on the door. And I remember this gentleman came in and he introduced himself as Mr. Coulter from the Department of Justice. And he asked to use the phone, and of course I let him use the phone. And so while he was waiting for the connection, he told us that we had some bad people in apartment 303 and that he had gone up there to investigate. But when he knocked on the door, the lady would not let him in and slammed the door in his face.
And what happened next?
Well, I tell you what, he then made the connection and he was telling the people on the other line all about the situation. And then he asked for help. And then he hung up and he was gonna leave. And I'm like, well, aren't you gonna wait for the help? But that's when he explained that he had left the other guy still upstairs and that he had to go and help that guy. So then he left. And well, I tell you what, it wasn't more than minutes later that I heard gunshots. And then I ran into the living room and I looked out the door, and that's when I saw Mr. Coulter running out of the building being chased by a man and this man firing at him. And then he went back into the building.
Counsel, you'll get your time. You'll get your time. Ms. Coffey, how many shots did you hear fired at that time?
At least 2. Well, I couldn't positively say. There were a lot of them.
Well, why don't you go on and tell us the rest of what you observed?
Well, there really wasn't much else happening out front. The door to the apartment was closed, but there was this FBI agent that had parked his car on the second tree on the intersection of Lexington and Lincoln, and he got out of his car and he yelled at Mr. Coulter that the guy that had been firing at him had come from the car down the street, and then Mr. Coulter started firing at him.
Now, did you observe anything else, Mrs. Coffey?
Well, that's when the policeman came to my door and he told us that, did you know that they had been firing bullets in the hallway? And I became so frightened because at that time, it was then I realized that...
Your Honor, I submit that that's not at all responsive to counsel's question.
Objection sustained.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just go ahead and tell us what you observed. Did you, for example, go into the building?
I went right up to apartment 303.
Now, did you observe the condition of the door to the apartment?
I did. There were bullet holes in it and in the casing.
That's all, Mrs. Coffey.
And that was Mrs. Coffey's testimony pretty much. There was some question about who actually paid the rent for the apartment. You see, I had been smart enough to send another gal, Beth Green, to pay the rent. And there were more questions about, in redirect, whether Billy had been seen in the apartment ironing, and she had. But the jury was more interested in all the gunshots. I guess they were pretty interesting.
The government calls Louis Meidlinger.
Louis Meidlinger.
Now, Meidlinger was quite a character. I'll tell you what, though. If I had asked him to light my cigarette for a month straight, he still wouldn't be able to identify me.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Please be seated.
What is your occupation, Mr. Meidlinger?
Oh, I'm the caretaker at the Lincoln Court Apartments at 9395 South Lexington in St. Paul. I've been there about 3.5 years.
Now, do you see the defendant Frechette here in the courtroom today?
Yeah, yes, I see her, yes.
Okay. Now, did you see her in and around apartment 303?
Can I? No, I don't believe I did.
Now, Mr. Meidlinger, would you maybe take your glasses off, take another look? Did you see her around apartment 303?
No, not her. No.
You're sure, Mr. Meidlinger?
Yeah, I'd remember her.
Well, okay. Let's take a different approach here. On the 31st of March, 1934, did you observe any trouble that happened around the building where apartment 303 is located?
Yes, I remember that. Yes, I remember that.
Well, why don't you tell us, sir?
Why didn't you say so? Yes. Here's what happened. I was talking with Miss Coffey, you know. She told you about that a little while ago, and She told me that two men had come in from the other side of the building, and that they said they were from the Department of Justice. And one of the men came to her door while I was talking to her, and he said he wanted to use the phone. And he went in, and I went into her apartment at the same time as he did. And he did use the phone and left, and then it seemed like only a few seconds later, I looked out the window and I saw this man, the one who used the phone. I saw him running out of the building, and another man was chasing him. And when they got in sight of one another, there was all kinds of commotion, and there were gunshots, and it was just a mess.
Now, the man that was running, can you state whether or not he had a gun?
No, I didn't see a gun, either man have a gun while they were running, but I heard shots, and each man shot once, I think.
Now, did you hear any other shooting other than the two shots that you just mentioned that you heard?
Oh yes, there was a lot of shooting up on the third floor of the building, up by apartment 303. Yeah, a lot of shooting.
Now, did you go out during this shooting, or did you remain in the apartment with Mrs. Coffey?
No, I stayed in Ms. Coffey's apartment for quite a while.
Now, when you came out of the apartment, did you go to apartment 303?
Yes, after the shooting stopped, yes.
And would you please tell us what you saw? Now, tell us what you saw there, Mr. Meidlinger.
Well, first thing, the hallway was full of people, men, federal agents and St. Paul police officers. And there were holes in the walls and in the doors, and lots of bullet holes. And you could see that a lot of the shooting had come from inside apartment 303. And the door to that apartment was just riddled with bullet holes. And I mean, I couldn't say how many shots were fired or how many holes there were, but I'll tell you, there were quite a few.
Now, did you ever observe the defendant, Evelyn Frechette, enter this building?
Well, I saw a lady, but I couldn't tell who it was.
Did this lady resemble Frechette?
Just a moment. Objected to as incompetent. This witness already said he couldn't tell who it was. No further foundation has been laid since the last question.
He may state whether or not she resembled this defendant.
Exception.
You may answer, Mr. Meidlinger.
Exception.
No, it was too far away.
Thank you, Mr. You may cross-examine Mr. Paquette.
In the cross-examination, Paquette was able to establish that, with Meidlinger, that Billy had not been the one to rent the apartment. But the court already knew that.
Your name is George J. Schroth,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
and you live where, Mr. Schroth?
I live at 105 Lexington Avenue, St. Paul, Minnesota.
And what is your occupation, Mr. Schroth?
I'm a student at St. Thomas College. I'm a sophomore there.
Now, did you notice anything particular in your neighborhood on March 31st, 1934?
Well, yes. I was in my backyard, which is located right across the alley from the apartment building at 95 Lexington. And I heard some gunshots. So I ran up to the front of my house to see what the big noise was. Just when I got there, I saw Mrs. Coffey open a window and yell at me to get back in the house.
Now, being a college student and generally taught to question everything, did you question the request or did you comply?
Objection, Your Honor. That question should be taken out and shot.
Mr. Paquette, if you wish to make an objection, make a legally recognized objection or sit down.
Okay, Your Honor. Question calls for facts that aren't in evidence. It's immaterial, irrelevant, and above all, incompetent.
Objection overruled. That question will also be answered.
Thank you, Your Honor. Please answer the question, Mr. Schroth, if you remember what it is.
Well, I went back in the house, and I looked out the window, and just then I saw a woman dressed in dark clothes come out from behind the apartment building. She was carrying a very large suitcase, and just as she got midway up the alley, she started to slip or stumble, as though the suitcase was very heavy. She turned and faced my direction, and just then I noticed a man coming out from behind the apartment building. He was dressed in gray clothes, but he was carrying a machine gun. But he wasn't running like the lady. He was merely walking.
And what happened when this man came out?
Well, the lady started heading west up the alley, and the man was casually walking behind her, but always keeping a good look behind him as though covering his retreat. And when I saw a man with a machine gun, I knew something very serious was going on, of course.
Now, did the sight of a man with a loaded machine gun cause you to do anything?
Well, yes. I went and telephoned St. Paul Police Headquarters to tell them what was going on. And when I came back, the woman was running the car out of the garage, and the man hopped in, and then they sped west down the alley and turned south on Dunlap, which is just 1 block west of Lexington.
Now, did you see anyone else besides this man and woman?
Oh, well, yes, I did see a St. Paul policeman standing on the corner of Lexington and Lincoln. I started going towards him, but just when I started to, he took off running west down the alley, or west down Lincoln, actually, but I caught up with him about halfway up the block on Lincoln. And I told him that the couple had escaped.
Now, Mr. Schroth, do you see any woman in the courtroom here today that resembles the woman that you saw leaving the apartment?
Yes, I do. That lady there, in the hat.
The defendant, Frechette?
Yes.
Evelyn Frechette?
Yes, sir. That lady there.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
Yes, you may, Mr.
Thank you,
Sullivan.
Your Honor. Now, Mr. Schroth, I show you what has been identified as Government Exhibit 4. Can you tell us whether you ever saw this man here, this man in this picture, around the apartment?
Yes, sir. That's the man that I saw.
I have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
And that was about all the witnesses the government had that could put Billy and I in the apartment together.
Chicago News, get your paper today. All the news about Chicago. Hot off the presses and into your hands.
Hey, kid, I'll take a paper.
Sure, mister. Hey, aren't you John Dillinger?
Nice guess, kid. Name's Hellman. Carl Hellman. Besides, do you think public enemy number 1 will be sitting here on a Chicago street corner buying a paper?
No, I guess not. But you sure look like him.
Hey, what's your name, kid?
Billy Madison.
Here you go, Billy. Keep the change.
Wow, a quarter. Thanks, Mr. Hellman.
You got it, kid. Now, the next day, it was the copper's turn to testify.
The government calls Thomas Jansen.
Thomas Jansen.
You see, the rest of the government's case rested on Billy's fingerprints and the statement that she gave after she was taken into custody. Remember this guy.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Please be seated.
Mr. Jansen, what is your occupation?
I've been employed by the St. Paul Police Department for 13 and a half years.
Did you go to 95 South Lexington in the city of St. Paul on March 31, 1934?
Yes, I did.
And what did you see when you got there?
Well, there were a number of Justice Department agents there and some members of the St. Paul Police Department. And I immediately went to work looking for latent fingerprints. I started in the bedroom.
Okay,
where-
just a minute, Mr. Jansen. Are you in any special division with the, or have any special assignment with the St. Paul Police Department?
I'm with the Identification Bureau. I do considerable fingerprint work, and I've been with that bureau for 2 years now.
Now, so part of your job is to search for articles that might disclose fingerprints.
Yes, it is.
So, when you made the search, did you find anything that might have disclosed fingerprints?
Objection, Your Honor. That's a kind of opinion that only an expert witness can give, not this witness.
Your Honor, I request that I be granted permission to qualify this witness as an expert, please.
Mr. Sullivan, I'm going to sustain the objection. You will need to lay more foundation for that certification.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, Mr. Jansen, are you a sworn police officer?
Yes, I am, and I have been for my entire career with the St. Paul Police Department.
And could you please describe for the court any course of study that you may have had in the science of fingerprinting?
Well, I've read numerous articles that the FBI has generated regarding fingerprinting. I've read virtually every article that has been published about fingerprinting, fingerprint analysis over the last couple of years. I have, on more than one occasion, worked with the FBI in fingerprint analysis and identification, and I'm the primary fingerprint analyst for the St. Paul Police Department.
So again, Mr. Jansen, I ask you, did you make a search for any articles that might, in your opinion, disclose fingerprints?
Yes, I made a thorough search.
And what did you find that might be of help to you?
Well, I found a beer bottle that looked very promising. I found a lady's powder case, and also a clip of bullets for an automatic rifle. There were also some other articles on the dresser in the bedroom, and other small things around the apartment.
Did you, how do you say it, lift any fingerprints from any of these objects?
Yes, I did. The first object that I looked at was the beer bottle, and so I marked that. And then the lady's powder case had some very nice prints on it, and I used those. And then there were some other articles around the apartment with prints as well.
And did you develop any prints?
Yes, I did.
Now, did you take any sample of the defendant Frichette's fingerprints for comparison?
Yes, I took Ms. Frichette's fingerprints, as well as obtaining copies of Mr. Dillinger's fingerprints.
And could you tell us what you determined from your analysis?
Well, I found numerous matches for the fingerprints of both the defendant, Ms. Frichette, and for Mr. Dillinger in the objects that we procured from the scene of the shootout there in the apartment.
Your witness, Mr. Paquette.
Now, Mr. Jansen, you want us all to believe that someone like you can correctly identify a person by a series of ink smudges that probably resemble a child's finger painting, and then use that evidence to convict somebody like Ms. Frichette of a crime in this case?
I expect you to believe scientific evidence about immutable physical characteristics. This is a science, not an art.
Okay.
Jansen was only one of the first experts to testify about fingerprints. I'll tell you, that jury probably learned more about fingerprints than they ever wanted to know. Who took the fingerprints? How do you take fingerprints? What are fingerprints? Who photographed the fingerprints? What happened to the fingerprints after they were taken? Long and short of it is, Billy's fingerprints were all over that apartment. And so were mine.
The government calls Agent Harold H. Reinecke.
Harold H. Reinecke.
And then they called the agent who had questioned Billy in Chicago after she was arrested. Now, this guy really got me going. He thinks he can treat my... I'll let you decide.
What you got?
I do.
Please be seated.
Where are you employed, Mr. Reinecke?
I have been with the United States Department of Justice for nearly 9 years.
Do you know the defendant Frichette?
Yes, sir. I met her in Chicago.
Now, did you have anything to do with the taking of her fingerprints when she was taken into custody?
Yes, sir. I took them on April 10th.
Now, did you have any conversation with the defendant Frichette?
I did.
Will you relate to us, please, the conversation that you had with her?
Well, I made an inquiry of Miss Frichette regarding her associations with John Dillinger, and she related to me substantially the following story. That she originally met John Dillinger in the fall of 1933 in Chicago through some girlfriends. That from that point on, she associated with and traveled with him almost continually. that they eventually traveled to St. Louis, Missouri, to Florida, back to Chicago, and eventually to Tucson, Arizona. That while she was in Tucson, Arizona with Mr. Dillinger and his associates were arrested, where they were returned back to the Crown Point, Indiana jail. Ms. Frechette traveled alone then by train to Chicago, after which she made one visit to Mr. Dillinger at the Crown Point jail, at which time she informed him that she was going to be renting a room at 901 Madison Street, but that she had not yet moved into that room at the time that she read in the newspaper of Mr. Dillinger's escape from the Crown Point jail.
Now, did she tell you if she ever met the Dillinger after that?
Yes, she did. She informed me that sometime thereafter she went to the front of the building at 901 Madison Street, that Mr. Dillinger pulled up in an automobile, that she entered the automobile and then traveled with Mr. Dillinger to St. Paul, Minnesota. That upon arrival in St. Paul, Minnesota, she rented an apartment under the name of Mrs. Irvine Olson. They resided there for a very short period of time, however, until they moved into apartment 303 at the building complex designated as 93 and 95 South Lexington, an apartment which she said had been rented for them by a woman who she claimed not to know. That the two of them then remained in that apartment on Lexington until March 31st.
Now, did she tell you what happened on that date?
Yes, sir. She stated that at approximately 10:30 a.m. there was a knock at the door, that she answered the door by unbolting the bolt lock, but leaving the chain latch on the door so she could see out about a 6 to 8 inch gap, that there were two gentlemen waiting outside of the door, and that they asked if they could see Mr. Hellman. Oh, incidentally, I should point out that she and Mr. Dillinger were renting the apartment under the name of Mr. and Mrs. Hellman, that she said that Mr. Hellman was not there, that they should come back in the afternoon. The two gentlemen at that point identified themselves as police officers and asked if they could speak with her. She informed them that she was not dressed and once again requested they come back in the afternoon. The two gentlemen were, however, quite insistent, asked to speak to her immediately, at which time she said she had to get dressed but that she would see them then. That is when she closed the door.
Now, did she tell you anything else that happened that day?
Yes, that immediately upon closing the door, she then bolted the bolt lock in addition to the chain latch that was on the door. That she went into the bedroom where Mr. Dillinger was waiting, and she informed him that there were two police officers at the door for him. Then Mr. Dillinger told her to keep her shirt on and to get dressed because she was quite agitated. The two of them then got dressed, and Mr. Dillinger threw a great deal of money into a suitcase and handed it to Miss Frechette. That Miss Frechette then followed him as he went into the living room, that upon entrance of the living room, he picked up a machine gun. He took the machine gun, aimed it in the general direction of the front door where the police officers had been waiting. That he then unleashed a burst of gunfire through the doorway in the direction where the police officers had been. He then went to the door, opened the door, went into the hallway. There was another burst, actually two bursts of machine gun fire in the hallway. At which point he said to her to follow me. At that point, she then followed him as he went through the back door of the hallway, down the 2 flights of stairs, to the alley, where he told her, get the car. He then waited in the alley. She went into the garage, removed the automobile, drove back to Mr. Dillinger. He entered the car, and the two of them drove away together.
Now, Mr. Reinecke, did you ever ask Miss Frechette if she knew that John Dillinger was a fugitive from justice?
Yes. I asked Miss Frechette if she knew at that time that John Dillinger was a fugitive from justice, and she said yes. In addition, I asked if she knew at that time that the federal agents were looking for John Dillinger, and she said yes.
And when did this conversation occur, Mr. Reinecke?
It was on April 10th at the Division of Investigation of the U.S. Department of Justice offices, 1900 Bankers Building, Chicago, Illinois, from approximately 10 in the morning until 8 in the evening.
I have no further questions of this witness, Your Honor.
Mr. Paquette, you may cross-examine.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Reinecke, your interrogation on April 10th, what time of day was this?
It was at intervals throughout the day of April 10th.
When you started to talk to Miss Frechette, did you describe to her what her rights were?
I informed her that any statement that she might make that would be incriminating in any case would naturally be used against her.
Did you ask her if she wanted a lawyer?
No.
Did you ask her if she had a lawyer?
No.
Did you ask her if she wanted to call a lawyer?
No.
And did you tell her that anything she might say during your interrogation would be used against her in court?
Words to that effect, yes.
And you were there to make sure that you got a statement from Miss Frechette that day, correct?
Yes.
And still, knowing that, knowing your mission that day, she volunteered the statement you just told us about.
She did volunteer her statement.
And of course, that is a prejudicial statement for the government's case, correct?
I consider it to be so, yes.
And with all the advice you gave her about her rights, she still volunteered that statement as your testimony today?
In response to questions I propounded to her, yes.
Mr. Reinecke, isn't it true that you are what's known in the division as the high-powered griller?
No.
Isn't it a fact that you have that reputation?
No.
Isn't it a fact that you slapped this girl in the face on April 10th?
I never slapped this girl at any time.
Your Honor, may I approach?
Yes, you may.
Isn't it correct, Mr. Reinecke, that you held your fist under this girl's chin the entire interrogation that day?
With my fist?
Oh, yes, or did you do it with either hand?
I believe I may be able to explain what you might be referring to, if you would permit me.
Go ahead.
Miss Frechette had a manner about her of not looking me in the eyes when she was speaking to me, so I would take 2 of the tips of my fingers only, and on 1 or 2 occasions, I would put them under her chin, and I would gently raise her face in my direction. I would then look her in the eye, and I would say, "Please, Evelyn, look at me when you are speaking to me and answering my questions." I was never rough or abusive.
Good for you, Mr. Reinecke. Isn't it true that Miss Frechette never signed a statement?
She did not.
But you contend that she made the statement you just told us about on direct examination.
Yes.
Is there anything she told you that you've forgotten to convey to the court today?
I cannot think of anything of any importance or even any minor detail that I have not related here today.
So, in other words, you're testifying that you relayed everything she said to this court.
I have related everything she said.
But without reference to any written statement.
You mean without my referring to any written statement?
Yes.
That's right.
So what you're saying, Mr. Reinecke, is that your testimony today is based entirely on facts that you have from your own recollection and your own memory, right?
Yes.
And this is based on obtaining information piecemeal over a period of 10 hours on that day?
Oh, over a period of 2 or 3 hours, Mr. Paquette.
No, Mr. Reinecke. You stated on direct that you interrogated Ms. Frechette from 10 a.m. until 8 p.m. that day, and you obtained all this information piecemeal over that period of time, did you not?
No, yes, that's right, that's correct.
During that lengthy interrogation, did you make any notes?
Not at the time I was talking to her, no.
Didn't consider it important?
Oh, I considered what she had to say to be very important.
Okay, but knowing just how important you treated it, you didn't reduce anything to writing.
That is right.
And you've been able to retain all of those facts during that 10-hour period in your memory, and your recollection is clear, Mr. Reinecke, without any written note, any statement.
That is correct.
That is all.
Well, when I found out Reinecke hit Billy, well, let's just say I was steaming mad, and I vowed right then and there to kill Harold Reinecke if I ever got my hands on him. And I would have. But Paquette threatened to give up on Billy's case if I did. So I had to stop trying. But Paquette did call Billy to the stand to testify in her own defense.
The defense calls Evelyn Frechette.
You see, the rest of the trial had been more of the same. Agents and witnesses talking about the fingerprints, talking about the statement Evelyn, Billy, had given to the police without a lawyer present and without being told about her rights and without any written statement. The lawyer for the doctor, Dr. May and Nurse Salt, got into the act trying to prove that I had made them take care of me under duress in Minneapolis. Just because I carry a gun with me at all times, people will think what they want. In any event, finally the prosecution rested. The lawyer for the federal government shut up for a while, and it was my gal's time to shine.
You are the defendant, Evelyn Frechette.
I am.
When and where were you born, Miss Frechette?
I was born in 1907 at Milford, Wisconsin.
Is that town on an Indian reservation?
Yes, it is.
And what is the tribe on that particular reservation?
Menominee.
Isn't it true that you're sometimes referred to by the nickname of Billy?
Yes.
And was your father an Indian?
No, my mother was a member of the tribe, and we lived on that reservation.
Did you attend an Indian school?
Yes, I got as far as the 8th grade.
How old were you when you finished school, Miss Frechette?
I was 17 when I finished 8th grade.
And what did you do after you finished school?
I went to Milwaukee to work.
How long did you work in Milwaukee?
About a year.
And where did you go then?
To Chicago.
How long have you lived in Chicago?
I still live there.
What sort of work have you done in Chicago?
I was a waitress and a sales lady and a nursemaid.
Miss Frechette, do you know the man John Dillinger?
Yes, I do.
Are you currently married to a man named George Sparks?
Welton Sparks, yes.
And presently you're not divorced from Mr. Sparks, correct?
Not yet, but I have started a divorce action.
When you started the divorce, did you know John Dillinger at that time?
No, I did not.
Billy had met
Wilton Sparks when she first moved to Chicago. She was 18, and she was lonely, and, well, he convinced her to marry him. Not long after, he was sentenced to Leavenworth for 15 years for mail fraud or something. She didn't know. So she started the divorce proceedings, and then she met me. I actually gave her the money to pay for the divorce proceedings.
Miss Frechette, when did you meet John Dillinger?
In November of 1933.
And have you known him from that time until the time you were taken into custody in this case?
Yes, Mr. Dillinger and I plan to be married.
Objection, Your Honor. That question's immaterial, and I ask that it be stricken from the record.
Objection sustained, Mr. Paquette. She could not become engaged to John Dillinger when she was married to another man, whatever the intent might be.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Miss Frechette, how was John Dillinger introduced to you?
By the name of Jack Harris.
Where did you meet him?
In Chicago, a woman came over and asked me to come to her house because they were going to have a party. So I went, and she introduced that man to me as Harris. He looked at me and said,
Where have you been all my life?
Miss Frechette, you and this man became close friends, intimate friends, correct?
yes.
And when did you first find out his name was really John Dillinger?
I really don't know.
Did he ask you at some time if you'd go traveling with him?
Oh, yes. In December in 1933, we just went on a little trip, and we went all the way to Florida. And we stayed there until after Christmas.
From that time on, when you were in his company, did you use various names?
Well, just for fun. He picked them out.
And you used the names that he picked out?
Yes, I did.
From Florida, you traveled then to St. Louis with Mr. Dillinger, and following that, Tucson, Arizona, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
And that was where John Dillinger was arrested.
Yes. I was taken into custody too, but of course, I was released.
And he was put into Crown Point Jail?
Yes.
Where did you go at that point?
I went up to Detroit for a bit and then back to Chicago to live with my sister.
When was the first time you were advised of John Dillinger's escape from Crown Point Jail?
I heard it on the radio, just like everyone else, on a Saturday night.
Do you know where Mr. Dillinger went after that?
Well, of course. He came back to Chicago, to me, and we took off for St. Paul.
Where did you stay while you were in St. Paul?
Mr. Dillinger had me get an apartment, and we stayed there for about 2 weeks.
Where did you go from there?
We went to some other place in St. Paul on Lexington Avenue.
Is that where you resided the date of March 31st, 1934?
Yes, sir.
Now, Ms. Frechette, will you tell the court in your own words what happened on that date?
Well, Mr. Dillinger and I were alone in the apartment, and he was still in bed. And at about 10:30, there was a knock on the door, and I went to answer it, and there were two men standing there. and they asked to speak to Carl. And I said, Carl? Carl who? I'd forgotten that Mr. Dillinger went by the name of Carl. And they said, Carl Hellman. And I said, well, he isn't here. Why don't you come back this afternoon? And then they said, well, can we talk to you? And I said, well, I'm not dressed. And, well, so then I said, all right. And I very, very politely said, please wait a minute while I go get dressed. And so I gently shut the door. And then I went to the back, and Mr. Dillinger said to me, who's there? And I said, a couple of policemen. And he said, well, don't let them in. Just get dressed and let's get out of here.
What happened then, Miss Frechette?
Well, I said, what are we going to do? And he said, never mind, just get dressed. So I did. I did what he said. And Johnny got a grip out, and he started packing, and he told me to throw a few of my things into it. So that's what I did, and right about then, I heard some gunshots. So I went over to the window and looked out, but I didn't see anything. But just then, Mr. Dillinger put a coat on, and he went out to the front door, and he started shooting. And I went running out there, and I said, my God, don't shoot. Just try and get out of here, but don't shoot. You can leave me here. I was all excited. I didn't know what to do. And then he said, no, you're coming with me. So I just started running down the hallway, and I ran down the back stairs. And when we got to the back door, Mr. Dillinger said, go get the car out of the garage. So I did, and he got in the back seat, and I drove off.
Did he tell you where to drive?
No, he didn't tell me where to drive then. He just told me the streets that I should turn down. And then he had me pull over to a side street and park. And that's when he told me that he was hurt, and I needed to call a friend to get some help.
Now, had you known before that he had been hurt?
No, he didn't tell me. But his friend got a doctor, and then we went to stay with a nurse for a few days until Mr. Dillinger was well enough to travel. And then we went back to Indiana, and then we went to Chicago, and that's where I was caught.
And that is where you were questioned?
Yes.
Did you then appear before a court sometime after that?
Yes, I did.
And you were then arraigned in connection with some charges?
Yes, I was.
Now, before that, Ms. Frechette, had anyone told you you were going to be arraigned on any charges?
No.
Had anyone accused you of harboring John Dillinger?
No, sir.
Did any agent during any conversation tell you that they had a warrant out for John Dillinger, a federal warrant?
No, sir.
Now, you were aware that John Dillinger was wanted by the Indiana authorities for his escape from Crown Point Jail, correct?
Well, yes, but so did everyone else. It was on the radio.
But did you know that he was named in any federal warrant?
No, sir.
Had you heard from anyone, from any source, that he had been named in any federal warrant?
No.
By the way, do you remember Agent Reenactment's testimony from earlier today?
Yes, I remember.
And do you remember hearing him say that on several occasions he lifted up your chin and said, Evelyn, please look me in the eyes?
He didn't lift up my chin, and he did not say please.
So this is not what really occurred, is it, Miss Frechette?
No, I would say he hit my chin up rather than lifting it up.
How often did Agent Reinecke do that during your conversation?
Many times. It hurt.
Miss Frechette, do you know where John Dillinger is right now?
I do not.
Did he tell you where he's planning to go next?
No, sir. I have no idea where he is right now.
Thank you. I have nothing further, Your Honor.
So there you have it. Paquette did ask the court to dismiss the charges against Billy because the prosecution had not proven that Billy was aware that there was a federal warrant for my arrest, which was necessary for the charge of harboring a fugitive. But the judge wouldn't hear any of it. Norby was tough as nails. So with the closing arguments made, the judge prepared to make a statement to the jury. You see, back then, federal judges were allowed to comment on the evidence. And this one sure did.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the testimony in this case has been closed, and counsel have completed their respective arguments, and it becomes the duty of the court to instruct you as to the law that is applicable in this case. Now, it's not for the court to say what the facts are. The court may have his own views regarding some of the evidence that's been produced here on the witness stand, and it may be that the court will take it upon himself to comment upon the evidence. The court may express his own views regarding the evidence, but of course, whatever the court may say is not binding upon you as to what the true facts are, because the court is not one of the judges of the facts. It is a crime under the laws of the United States for any person to harbor or conceal any person for whose arrest a warrant or process had been issued under the provision of the law of the United States. And this statute provides that anyone who does so harbor or conceal any such person under such circumstances, so as to prevent his discovery and arrest after notice or knowledge of the fact that a warrant has been issued for the apprehension of such person, shall be guilty of violating that statute. This defendant is not charged with harboring and concealing. She is charged with entering into a conspiracy for that purpose, with the object of harboring and concealing one for whom a warrant had been issued under the laws of the United States. Now, it doesn't seem to me that you'll have any great trouble in determining that there was an agreement and a plan to conceal and harbor John Dillinger from being apprehended. It is admitted that when he lived in the apartment on Lexington Avenue under the name of Hellman, it is admitted that when a federal officer came to the door of the Lexington apartment and asked for Hellman, Miss Frechette, who knew that John Dillinger was going under the name of Hellman, told the officers that Hellman was not in. It is admitted that Miss Frechette drove John Dillinger away after the shooting to secrete him in a place to be cared for by a doctor and a nurse. Now, what knowledge did Miss Frechette have of the fact that a warrant had been issued against John Dillinger? It's not necessary for the government to prove that she had actual direct knowledge that a warrant had been issued. It's not incumbent upon the government to prove that written notice had been served to her. Knowledge may be proved by circumstances, and it's sufficient in this case if the government has furnished such evidence that warrants the deduction that this defendant had knowledge of the issuance of the warrant. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, my charge has been unreasonably long, and I'm afraid has been entirely too verbose. I trust, however, that the court has been able to be of some assistance to you in clarifying these issues. You are sitting here now as servants of the law, and your only interest is to do, under the evidence, what is right and what is just.
Well, Paquette made an exception, arguing that the words of the court were argumentative and prejudicial, but it didn't make any difference. The jury found Billy guilty of conspiring to harbor a criminal.
I'm a convict. Ever since the 3rd of June, when the federal judge sentenced me to 2 years, I've been at the United States Detention Farm in Milan, Michigan. I'm not Billy or even Evelyn Frechette anymore. I'm a number. Just like Machine Gun Kelly's wife, who's here too, and all the rest of the girls at the farm. I guess this is where they all end up. Maybe I had it coming to me. I don't know. But I keep telling myself that I'm different. I'm not here because I did something wrong, but because I fell in love with the wrong man.
Billy served 19 months. After she got out, after a while, she sold her story to True Confessions the True Romance, and the Chicago Herald and Tribune. After a while, she went on a theatrical touring show with members of my family. But on September 13th, 1969, she died of cancer in Shawano, Wisconsin. Poor Billie, I always had a soft spot in my heart for her. As for me, well, I stayed free for a while. I saw a movie. I remember running down an alley. But I'll tell you this, I never saw the inside of a jail cell again. But that's another story for another night.
Thank you all very much here. We're now breaking character. I'm not really Harold Reineke. Just for a few moments, we found that we had a request that we take about a 5, 6, 7 minute point here to do a little aftermath of people other than, we don't know a lot of the people, but for a few of the high points. And to introduce that little segment we're going to have of updates and what came thereafter, we are going to introduce our director. Now understand, we are all lawyers and judges here, not actors, as was obvious to all of you today. With a few cameos by like an elected official and a police officer. And this poor guy had to try to direct a mostly lawyer group. And being a non-lawyer, he didn't quite know how to get attention of people who have short attention spans. I will point out, though, his background as a master sergeant in the Air Force was very helpful periodically. So we want to thank Steve Peterson. Come on out to lead this part of it. Steve.
Take issue with the fact that JP says that these are lawyers and not actors. I think lawyers are some of the better actors I've ever seen. Okay, and I would like to thank you all for attending our performance tonight. As JP said, what we're going to do is sort of if you remember the old Paul Harvey, you know, he'd give you a little bit of history about somebody like that day, and then he'd say, now we'll go to the rest of the story. So that's what we're going to do tonight, very short segment. And last night, we had the pleasure of having Louis Meidlinger's relatives here. We had his grandson and I believe another son. Yes. Tonight, we have the pleasure of having relatives of Judge Gunnar Nordby, and we'd like to have these people stand up and get a little bit of applause there. Now, I didn't know until after we were upstairs at the reception that there were some other people who were related to some of these people on stage, or at least the characters. And so I'm going to ask in the audience, is there any more associations that we have here, or relations? No. See, JP, I told you.
That they're willing to admit to.
Okay. Just 4 little short presentations we have here. The first is about George Sullivan, who was a prosecutor, and Justice Paul Anderson will tell you a little bit about him.
Now, I played George Sullivan, who was the U.S. District Attorney. He was a Minnesota native. He was born in Shakopee, Minnesota in 1886. Went to the University of Minnesota Law School, graduated there in 1908. And he practiced law in Jordan. And between 1913 and 1923, he was the Scott County Attorney. It was a part-time position at that time, so he both practiced law and was the county attorney in Scott County. Then in 1933, after the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, he was a Democrat, He was appointed as the U.S. District Attorney. He served there for 4 years, and then in 1937, he was appointed to the federal bench. And how different it was then, he was nominated on August 12th, 1937. He was confirmed on August 17, 1937, and he took office on August 30th, 1937. Very different than it is today. He served until April 14th, 1944, when he died.
Good. Next one up is Rick Stebbins, who will tell us about Louis Paquette.
Louis Paquette was a Chicago defense attorney in probably the worst sense of the phrase. And much of the facts I actually owe to Douglas Heidenreich for digging this up. You never want to play Trivial Pursuit with him. He was a city prosecutor first in Chicago, so he was actually on the other side of the law. And he was a politician of very little remark, and then he was a bartender as well. And he was a bartender during the time he went to night school to become the attorney he did become. He had a very busy year at and about the time of this trial, because starting out that year was when Dillinger was arrested. Louis Paquette went and argued for a continuance of that proceeding until March 12th of 1934. Then during that time, he went and employed the services of a German woodworker to carve a gun and polish it with shoe polish, smuggle it into Crown Point Jail. And with a little wooden gun you can see a picture of upstairs, John Dillinger, to his great credit, disarmed 30 armed prison guards, took their guns, shot his way out of the prison, and drove off in the sheriff's truck. So, very, very productive lawyering. Then in early May, just shortly before this trial began, Louis Paquette again used his lawyering skills to line up 2 plastic surgeons to try and change the appearance of John Dillinger. Somewhat unsuccessfully. If you look at that picture, he's as ugly as ever. And then he spent time around the Midwest. Yeah, no offense to Patrick. I mean, they could be brothers. But he spent his time riding around the Midwest trying to line up residences for the different members of the gang. Paquette himself was arrested later in the summer of 1934 for the same charges that Miss Frechette faced, a conspiracy to harbor John Dillinger. He was acquitted of that charge later that summer, primarily based upon his own closing exclamation to the jury that, "I wish I had never seen the damn face of John Dillinger." He could only say this, of course, because Dillinger had died a couple of months earlier and he was at no risk. So 6 months later, Louis Paquette did finally, with substantial doses of double jeopardy by the government, he did face another charge of conspiracy to harbor a criminal, the criminal being the first lieutenant of John Dillinger, Homer Van Meter, who was also killed in St. Paul. And he was found guilty on these charges. He was sent to jail at Leavenworth for 1 year and 9 months. He was disbarred in June of 1936, and he ended up dying in Chicago in 1951 at the age of 71. One bright spot before he died in 1951, he was pardoned by Harry S. Truman of all of his convictions, but he never practiced law again, not even in the city of Chicago.
Next up, we have Tony Palumbo, who is going to talk about Gunnar Nordby. So the people in the back there may want to listen.
We should have a dialogue there. I'm not sure I can do this. Judge Nordby, Gunnar H. Nordby, was born in 1889 in Norway. He was the youngest of 4 children. Now, correct me if I say something wrong. He was the youngest of 4 children, and he emigrated to the United States when he was only 1 year old. They lived in Minneapolis, my understanding, and eventually the family had to work very, very hard, like every other immigrant family. And Judge Nordby worked himself up and became a Hennepin County District Court judge. In 1931, President Herbert Hoover appointed Judge Nordby. It was called a recess appointment. What that means, of course, is that Congress was not in session. So he was appointed on the authority of the President, and then he was confirmed in 1932 by the Senate. Okay, when this trial took place, Judge Nordby was 45 years old. And I understand he was very fond of bow ties and not the clip-on kinds. I have to apologize for that. Judge Nordby was known probably as the dean of trial judges. He was very well respected. I'm told that when he was on the bench, he was rather stern, but when he was off the bench, he was really quite a warm and congenial man, very active in his community. Now, Judge Nordby remained on the federal bench until November 5th, 1977, when he passed away. So you're looking at a 46-year career for Judge Nordby. And now, correct me if I'm wrong, family, I understand he had a little, every morning he had a little ritual, is that true, at sunrise?
On vacation.
On vacation. The ritual at sunrise is that he would toast the sunrise with a glass of aquavit, is that true?
Grape juice and bourbon.
Stand corrected.
Paquette the bartender taught him that one, yeah.
The opposite. Good. He was really quite a remarkable man, obviously, as you will agree with me, and was a very well-respected judge. And again, when he remained on the bench, got a little hard of hearing, of course, later on in his life. But he had a full head of hair, is that correct? Right, so right at the end. Full head of white hair.
Oh, good.
I got one thing right anyway. Not the bow tie, but I got the hair. But, yes, so I was proud to play Judge Norton.
Right. Winding up our little presentation, J.P. Baroni will be talking about something that's quite familiar and probably some of you have heard about. It's the O'Connor system with the St. Paul Police Department.
Okay, thank you. And again, I need to point out, first of all, Professor Doug Heidenreich here has been our teacher throughout this process to teach us this. Not that he was personally there.
Pretty close.
And understand, Louis Meidlinger was 33 when he testified, and Doug pulls it off perfectly. But he really has been our resource on trying to get some of this right. We've gotten close. So Doug, have lawyers speak affectionately of the law professor is a rare thing. Having said that, the O'Connor system, I'm sure at least half of you know about it. Raise your hand if you do not know what the O'Connor system is. I did that, okay. We got enough that justifies this quick thing. Bottom line is this, right as soon as it's over, you're going to go upstairs and see a lot of information about it, and the police officers will explain it. Reader's Digest version is this. At about the turn of the last century, right after 1900, John J. O'Connor became the police chief in St. Paul. John J. O'Connor determined the best way to keep the people of St. Paul safe was to invite all the criminals to come to St. Paul. Under the proviso that they would not commit any crimes against anybody locally anywhere in Ramsey County. If they had an outstanding warrant to be extradited somewhere else, he wouldn't bother to do it, as long as nobody here got hurt, and as long as they paid a certain fee for the service. Well, even though O'Connor left as chief, we had many, many, many other chiefs. The O'Connor system pervaded and continued in 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, into the 1930s, when it got most famous during the so-called gangster era. The bottom line is this, there were a lot of very honest cops who had to deal under this, but a few people at top were taking some money to say, leave them alone, nobody's getting hurt, and that was going on. Many, many attempts by mayors to put in reform police chiefs, some good ones that were undermined by their lieutenants, others that moved on. In 1 year, they had 3 different police chiefs in 1 calendar year, as I remember. So it was not a job for longevity. But eventually, right at this time, when all of a sudden the people thought their version of the O'Connor system meant, if I don't do anything in Ramsey County and I spend all my time at that resort area in White Bear Lake and don't do anything but drink in St. Paul and don't get any trouble, means I can shoot a police officer in South St. Paul because it's in Dakota County, that was not looked upon very fondly. Robbing a bank at Riverside location, barely in Hennepin County. But what really broke it was, of course, the kidnapping of Edward Bremer of the Bremer banking fortune and Bill Ham of the Ham's brewing fortune, who both lived in St. Paul. And suddenly the reform chiefs were there, the cops who worked under these conditions for years suddenly felt freedom and could breathe well, and it all went on from there. That's the shorthand version of the O'Connor system that led to people finding apartments and places in St. Paul as a place to be.
You forgot one thing.
Yes.
Wasn't Chief O'Connor paid for?
Well, I mentioned there was a small fee they paid. I said that it was paid to O'Connor, if that wasn't clear. It was not actually at the main licensing division. Where you didn't get a little card, you know. It was an informal payment system, if that's really what you wanted to do. The final point I want to make is, don't you think it's a great thing that men should go back to vests, handkerchiefs, and pockets, double-breasted? Is this not the look we should have? Let's bring that back, everyone.
After dismissed here on third floor here in 317 is the Dillinger exhibit. Please feel free to wander through that, and Officer Paul Johnson will be up there, and there'll be other people to answer any questions. Also, then come over to the reception and room 326, which is just sort of down the hall, and we have refreshments there, and you can chat with cast members and myself and people who are involved in the show.
See you on the third floor. Thank you.